The rain drummed against the windshield of the olive-green Jeep as it wound through the narrow roads of Normandy, France. October 1954. 9 years since the last shot was fired, yet the scars remained etched into the landscape like memories refusing to fade. Sergeant Marcus Kane pressed his face closer to the passenger window, watching the familiar countryside roll past in shades of grey and brown. "First time back since the war?" asked Lieutenant Davies, the young British officer assigned as his driver and translator. Marcus nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. The smell of wet earth and dying leaves carried him back instantly. Back to June 6, 1944, when he'd crawled through hedgerows with German bullets whistling overhead, back to the taste of blood and gunpowder that had lingered for weeks afterward. "Must be strange," Davies continued, oblivious to Marcus's inner turmoil. "Coming back as an inspector instead of a soldier." Strange didn't begin to cover it. Marcus had volunteered for the Allied Disarmament Commission, partly out of duty, partly out of curiosity, but mostly because he couldn't sleep through the night anymore in his small apartment in Pittsburgh. The nightmares had gotten worse lately, not better as everyone said they would. Dreams of faceless enemies, of voices calling his name in languages he didn't understand, of photographs that changed when he wasn't looking at them. The jeep slowed as they approached a checkpoint manned by French gendarmes. Beyond it, barely visible through the mist, stood the skeletal remains of what had once been the Kruger Metalwerke, a weapons factory that had supplied the Atlantic Wall with artillery shells and small arms until Allied bombers had silenced it in early 1944. "Papers, s'il vous plaît," requested the gendarme, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Davies handed over their documents, while Marcus studied the factory ruins. Something about the place made his skin crawl, though he couldn't pinpoint why. The main building had partially collapsed, its red brick walls blackened by fire and time. Twisted metal beams jutted from the rubble like broken ribs, and weeds had begun to claim the courtyard where German workers once hurried between shifts. "The local authorities cleared the site last month," Davies explained, as they drove through the gates. "No unexploded ordnance found, but they want a thorough catalogue of any remaining weapons or materials before they level the whole thing for reconstruction." Marcus pulled his collar higher against the wind. The factory felt wrong somehow, not just abandoned, but actively hostile. As they parked near the main entrance, he noticed that no birds sang in the surrounding trees, no insects buzzed in the air. Even the rain seemed to fall more quietly here, as if the very atmosphere absorbed sound. The interior of the building was a maze of debris and shadows. Their flashlights carved narrow tunnels of light through the darkness, illuminating overturned machinery, scattered papers that crumbled at a touch, and the occasional glint of metal buried under years of dust and neglect. "Administrative offices should be down this corridor," Davies said, consulting a hand-drawn map provided by the French authorities. "If there are any records of weapons caches or hidden storage areas, that's where we'll find them." They picked their way carefully through the rubble, Marcus's combat boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The sound echoed strangely in the cavernous space, as if the building itself was listening to their progress. Halfway down the corridor, Marcus stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Davies paused, tilting his head. "Hear what?" "Sounds like machinery, humming." They stood in silence for nearly a minute, but Marcus could have sworn he detected a low, rhythmic vibration coming from somewhere deep in the building. Davies shrugged and continued forward, but Marcus remained frozen. The sound reminded him of something, a memory just beyond his reach, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The administrative section had suffered less damage than the factory floor. Most of the offices still had their doors intact, though many stood ajar like surprised mouths. They began their systematic search in what appeared to be the main executive suite, a corner office with tall windows that would have offered a commanding view of the factory grounds. The desk had been cleared long ago, probably by retreating Germans or scavenging locals, but the filing cabinets remained. Davies began photographing documents while Marcus searched for anything that might indicate hidden weapons caches or storage facilities. It was behind the third filing cabinet that Marcus found it. The safe was small, perhaps 2 feet square, built into the wall and concealed behind a false panel that had partially shifted over the years. The metal door bore no marking save for a series of numbers: 06, 06, 44. D-Day. "Davies," Marcus called, his voice hoarse. "Come look at this." The young lieutenant hurried over, camera still in hand. "Bloody hell! How did the French miss this?" Marcus ran his fingers along the safe's edge. The metal was surprisingly free of rust, as if it had been sealed against time itself. The combination: it's June 6th, 1944. D-Day? That's a bit obvious, don't you think? But Marcus was already turning the dial, his fingers moving as if guided by muscle memory. Right to 0, left to 6, right to 0, left to 6, right to 4, left to 4. The mechanism clicked with a sound like breaking bones, and the heavy door swung open on silent hinges. Inside were 3 items: a manila envelope, a small black notebook, and a photograph. Marcus reached for the photograph first, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The black and white image showed a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, standing in front of what appeared to be the same factory, but intact, with German workers visible in the background. The child wore simple clothes: knickers, suspenders, a white shirt. His hair was tousled, his expression serious beyond his years. The boy in the photograph was Marcus Kane. "That's impossible," Davies breathed, looking over Marcus's shoulder. "You would have been, what, in your 20s during the war?" Marcus's hands shook as he turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink were the words: Marcus Heinrich Kruger, age 8, September 1923. 20 years before Marcus Kane had been born in Pittsburgh. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, cream-colored and expensive, filled with precise handwriting in fountain pen ink. The words were in English, but the script had a distinctly European character. "My dear Marcus, if you are reading this letter, then the temporal calculations were correct, and you have returned to us as predicted. I know this must be confusing, indeed impossible, but I assure you that every word I write is the truth. You are not who you believe yourself to be. The memories of your childhood in Pittsburgh, of your adoptive parents Robert and Margaret Kane, of your life before the war, all of these are carefully constructed fabrications necessary to protect both you and the project. Your true name is Marcus Heinrich Kruger. You are my son, and this factory was our home until circumstances forced me to send you away. The experiments conducted in the basement laboratory of this facility achieved what the Reich scientists could only dream of: temporal displacement. Not time travel in the crude sense, but the ability to move consciousness, memory, personality, identity, backward and forward along the timeline of a single life. When it became clear that Germany would lose the war, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I sent your consciousness forward 20 years into the body and life of an American soldier who would survive the coming battle for Normandy. You have been living his life, believing it to be your own, but the convergence point has arrived. You must remember who you truly are, Marcus. The Allied forces will soon discover the true nature of our work here, and when they do, you will be the only one who can prevent them from misusing technologies they do not understand. Go to the basement laboratory. Find the woman Eleanor Dubois in the village of Sainte Marguerite. She has been waiting for you. Trust no one else, not even your British companion. The choice is yours, my son. Remain Marcus Kane and live a lie, or reclaim your birthright as Marcus Heinrich Kruger and help me correct the greatest mistake in human history. With love and hope for forgiveness, your father, Dr. Heinrich Kruger. P.S. The photograph will help you remember. Look at your reflection in any mirror, then look at the photograph again. You will see Marcus read the letter 3 times before the words truly penetrated his consciousness. Each reading seemed to unlock another layer of impossibility, another crack in the foundation of everything he had believed about himself. "Marcus?" Davies's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You've gone white as a sheet. What does it say?" But Marcus couldn't speak. He was staring at the photograph again, and with a growing sense of horror, he began to see it. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw, the way the light fell across the child's face, features that would be familiar to anyone who had looked in a mirror for 31 years. The third item in the safe was the black notebook. Marcus opened it with trembling fingers and found page after page of precise German script, interspersed with mathematical formulas, scientific diagrams, and what appeared to be technical specifications for machinery he couldn't identify. But it was the margins that made his blood run cold. Scattered throughout the notebook were small sketches, doodles made absent-mindedly during long hours of work. A soldier's helmet here, a landing craft there, the distinctive shape of Omaha Beach as seen from the bluffs above, images that Marcus Kane had seen with his own eyes, images that Heinrich Kruger could never have witnessed. Unless, "We need to get out of here," Davies said suddenly, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." Marcus looked up from the notebook, still dazed by its implications. "What?" "I said we need to leave. There are vehicles approaching, multiple engines coming fast." Through the broken windows, Marcus could hear it now. The deep rumble of military trucks, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. Whoever was coming, they weren't French gendarmes making a routine patrol. "The basement," Marcus said, almost without thinking. "There's something in the basement we need to see." "Are you mad? We need to get to the jeep." "No." Marcus's voice carried a strange authority, as if he were remembering how to command rather than learning it for the first time. The letter mentioned a laboratory. If we're going to understand any of this, if we're going to make sense of what's happening, we need to go down there. Davies stared at him as if seeing a stranger. "Marcus, what's gotten into you? You're talking like I belong here." Marcus finished. The photograph felt warm in his hand, almost alive. "Maybe I do." The sound of car doors slamming echoed through the factory, heavy boots on concrete, voices speaking in a language that wasn't French or English. Russian, Marcus realized with a chill. "The Soviets," Davies whispered. "They must have been monitoring our communications. They're after the same thing we are." "Then we'd better find it first." Marcus pocketed the photograph and letter, tucked the notebook under his arm, and headed for the door. But not toward the exit. Toward the interior of the building, toward whatever lay hidden in the depths below. "Marcus, this is insane," Davies hissed, but he followed anyway. They found the stairway behind a door marked "Verboten, Authorized Personnel Only" in faded German letters. The steps descended into absolute darkness, their flashlight beams barely penetrating the gloom. The air grew colder with each step, and that strange humming sound Marcus had noticed earlier grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs was a corridor lined with doors, each marked with a number and a German word. Labor 1, Verschiebung. Labor 2, Bewusstsein. Labor 3, Zeitrechnung. Displacement, consciousness, temporal calculation. "My God," Davies breathed. "What were they doing down here?" Marcus didn't answer. He was walking toward the last door in the corridor, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. The placard read, "Labor 4, Hauptexperiment," the main experiment. The door was unlocked. Beyond it lay a room that defied every assumption Marcus had made about Nazi science and technology. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, their lights blinking in steady patterns, despite having been abandoned for nearly a decade. In the center of the room stood a chair that looked more like a torture device than a scientific instrument, surrounded by a complex array of mirrors, cameras, and what appeared to be some form of advanced recording apparatus. But it was the wall of photographs that stopped Marcus cold. Dozens of pictures, all black and white, all showing the same person at different ages and in different circumstances. Here was the 8-year-old boy from the safe. There was a teenager in German military uniform. A young man in a laboratory coat standing beside the very equipment that surrounded Marcus now. A soldier in American gear crouched behind cover on a beach that looked remarkably like Omaha. All the faces were his own. "This isn't possible," Marcus whispered. But even as he spoke the words, memories began to surface. Not the false memories of Marcus Kane's childhood in Pittsburgh, but something deeper and stranger. The taste of German bread. The sound of his father's voice explaining temporal theory. The feeling of consciousness being torn from one moment and thrust into another, like waking from a dream within a dream. "Marcus!" Davies's voice was barely a whisper. "Look at this." The lieutenant was standing beside a desk covered with papers and journals. On top of the pile was a newspaper, its headline still clearly visible despite the years. "Normandy invasion succeeds. Allied forces establish beachhead." The date was June 7th, 1944. "This is yesterday's news," Davies said slowly. "From 1944. How is there a newspaper from yesterday?" But Marcus was no longer listening. He was staring at the chair in the center of the room, and slowly, impossibly, he was beginning to remember. The sound of footsteps on the stairs above them echoed through the silence. Russian voices getting closer. And somewhere in the darkness of the laboratory, something began to hum with increasing intensity, as if the machinery was waking up after a long sleep. Marcus looked at the photograph in his hand one more time. The child's eyes seemed to be looking directly at him, across 20 years and the impossible gulf between two lives. "Eleanor Dubois," he whispered. "Sainte Marguerite." The footsteps were getting closer. The humming intensified to a low roar that seemed to vibrate through Marcus's bones. The electronic equipment along the laboratory walls began to pulse with increasing urgency, casting strange shadows that danced like living things across the photograph-covered wall. "We need to go," Davies whispered urgently, but his voice seemed distant, unreal. Marcus couldn't move. He was transfixed by the chair in the center of the room, by the sudden flood of sensations that felt like drowning in reverse. Memories surfacing from depths he hadn't known existed within his own mind. A man in a white coat, adjusting dials on a massive console. "It will only hurt for a moment, Marcus. When you wake up, you'll be safe. You'll be American. You'll survive the war." The taste of copper pennies in his mouth. The feeling of his thoughts scattering like startled birds. Darkness. Then light. Then waking up in a hospital bed in Pittsburgh with kind strangers calling him their adopted son. "Marcus!" Davies grabbed his arm. "The Russians are almost here!" The footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. Russian voices, closer now, barking orders. Through the open laboratory door, Marcus could see flashlight beams dancing in the corridor. But something else was happening. The mirrors surrounding the chair had begun to reflect not the laboratory, but other scenes, other times. In one, Marcus saw himself as a child, working alongside his father in this very room. In another, he witnessed his own consciousness being torn away, uploaded into some impossible machine. A third showed him crawling up Omaha Beach, bullets whining overhead, with no memory of how he'd gotten there or who he really was. "The temporal field," he whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "The machinery, it's still active. It's been running for 10 years. Davies stared at him in horror. "What are you talking about?" But before Marcus could answer, the laboratory door burst open. 3 Soviet soldiers entered, their AK-47s trained on the 2 Allied officers. Behind them came a tall, gaunt man in civilian clothes, his pale eyes scanning the room with obvious familiarity. "Dobro pojalovat domoi, Marcus Kruger," the man said in accented English. "Welcome home." Marcus felt Davies tense beside him, but his own reaction surprised him. Instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of recognition. The man's face triggered another fragment of buried memory. Late-night conversations, hushed arguments about ethics and temporal theory, the acrid smell of cigarettes and fear. "Dr. Volkov," Marcus said, the name coming from nowhere. "You worked with my father." The Russian smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "So you do remember. Excellent. The convergence is proceeding exactly as Heinrich predicted." "I don't understand any of this," Davies said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Who are these people? What convergence?" Volkov ignored him, focusing entirely on Marcus. "Your father was a brilliant man, but he made one critical error. He believed that consciousness could be cleanly transferred from one timeline to another, that you could live the life of Marcus Kane without consequence. He didn't account for temporal bleed-through." The humming grew louder. The mirrors began to show more scenes, moments from both lives, layering over each other like double-exposed photographs. Marcus saw himself receiving his American citizenship papers, superimposed over an image of himself in Hitler Youth uniform. He watched his first kiss with a girl named Susan from Pittsburgh, while simultaneously experiencing the memory of helping his father calibrate the temporal displacement device. "The timelines are colliding," Volkov continued, stepping closer. "Marcus Kane's memories and Marcus Kruger's memories fighting for dominance. Soon, one will consume the other entirely. The question is, which one do you want to keep?" "This is madness," Davies whispered. But Marcus was beginning to understand. The nightmares, the strange moments of déjà vu, the way certain German words felt familiar on his tongue. It was all the result of two lifelines bleeding into each other, two sets of memories occupying the same consciousness. "What do you want?" Marcus asked. "What I've always wanted," Volkov replied. "To complete the work your father began. The Soviet Union has been searching for this technology for years. Imagine the possibilities, agents who could be inserted into any timeline, who could alter history itself. The Cold War could be won before it truly begins. And if I refuse?" Volkov's smile widened. "You misunderstand. You don't have a choice. The convergence is already happening. Look at yourself." Marcus looked down at his hands and gasped. They were flickering, becoming transparent for brief moments before solidifying again. When he looked up, his reflection in the mirrors showed both faces simultaneously, the American soldier and the German boy, occupying the same space, fighting for the same body. "The temporal field is destabilizing," Volkov explained. "Without intervention, both versions of you will cease to exist. The only way to survive is to choose one timeline and allow it to consume the other completely." "But why here?" Marcus asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Why now?" "Because this is where it began," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. A woman stood silhouetted against the corridor light, tall, elegant, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. She moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger, and Marcus noticed that the Russian soldiers' weapons were no longer trained on him and Davies, but on her. "Eleanor Dubois," Marcus breathed. She nodded. "I've been waiting for you, Marcus." "Both of you, in a sense." Volkov barked an order in Russian, and his men raised their rifles, but Eleanor didn't seem concerned. "You won't shoot me, Doctor, not yet. You need what I know." "What do you know?" Marcus asked. Eleanor's gaze never left Volkov as she answered. "I know that your father didn't just send your consciousness forward in time. He created a temporal loop. Marcus Kane was never a real person. He was a construct, a shell designed to house your displaced consciousness. But the loop is unstable. Every time you return to this place, to this moment, the boundaries between the timelines weaken." "Return?" Davies said. "What do you mean, return?" "This isn't the first time we've had this conversation," Eleanor said softly. "Marcus has been caught in this loop for 10 years, reliving variations of the same events over and over. Sometimes he remembers more, sometimes less. But each iteration, the temporal bleed-through gets worse. Marcus felt the world spinning around him. The memories weren't just conflicting, they were repeating. How many times had he discovered the photograph? How many times had he stood in this laboratory, learning the truth about his identity? How many times had he made the choice between Marcus Kane and Marcus Kruger? The Americans will be here soon, Eleanor continued. They've been tracking Soviet movements in the area. When they arrive, there will be a firefight. In the chaos, someone will damage the temporal equipment. The loop will reset, and Marcus will wake up tomorrow morning in his hotel in Bayeux, with only the faintest memory of having dreamed something important. Unless, Volkov prompted, unless we break the loop permanently, but that requires a sacrifice. Eleanor's eyes found Marcus's. One of your timelines must die completely, not just suppressed or buried, destroyed. Only then can the other exist freely. The laboratory shook suddenly, dust raining from the ceiling. Outside, Marcus could hear the distant rumble of approaching vehicles, American engines by the sound of them. Decide quickly, Volkov urged. Choose Marcus Kane and return to your simple American life, but lose everything that made you special, everything that made you Heinrich Kruger's son. Choose Marcus Kruger and gain access to temporal science beyond imagination, but accept that you were once a Nazi, that you participated in experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. There's a third option, Eleanor said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. Refuse to choose. Let the timelines collapse into each other completely. It will destroy you, but it will also destroy the loop, the machinery, everything. No one will ever be able to use this technology again. The sound of gunfire erupted somewhere above them, American voices shouting orders, more Russian voices responding. The battle for the factory had begun. Marcus looked at the photograph in his hand, the 8-year-old boy who had become both victim and perpetrator, savior and destroyer. Then he looked at the mirrors, still showing fragments of both lives, and finally at the chair that had started it all. How many times have I stood here? He asked Eleanor. This is the 47th iteration. And what did I choose before? You never chose. That's why the loop continues. You always try to find a fourth option, some way to save everyone and everything. But time doesn't allow for perfection, Marcus. Sometimes survival requires sacrifice. Another explosion, closer this time. The laboratory lights flickered, and the temporal field fluctuated wildly. In the mirrors, Marcus could see dozens of versions of himself, some in American uniform, some in German, some in civilian clothes, all standing in this same room, all facing the same impossible choice. Davies grabbed his arm. Whatever you're going to do, do it now. The ceiling won't hold much longer. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to think past the chaos, past the competing memories and the weight of 46 previous failures. What did he really want? What did either version of himself truly desire? The answer came not from memory, but from something deeper, from the part of his consciousness that existed independent of timeline or identity. He wanted the truth. Eleanor, he said, opening his eyes, you said you've been waiting for me. What aren't you telling us? She hesitated, glancing at Volkov and his men, then back at Marcus. The temporal displacement technology. It wasn't created to save you from the war. It was created to prevent something much worse. What? Your father discovered something in his research, a temporal anomaly that would appear in 1954, an event that would cascade through history, ultimately leading to global nuclear war by 1962. He sent your consciousness forward, not to save your life, but to position you at the exact place and time where you could prevent the catastrophe. The building shook again. Through the laboratory door, Marcus could see smoke beginning to drift down the corridor. What kind of event? He demanded. The kind that happens when Soviet agents gain access to temporal displacement technology, Eleanor said, looking directly at Volkov. The Russian's face went pale. You're lying. The loop wasn't created by accident, Eleanor continued. Heinrich designed it as a failsafe. If Marcus failed to prevent the Soviet acquisition of the technology, time would reset, giving him another chance. But the system was only meant to last a few iterations. After 47 attempts, the temporal machinery is breaking down. The next reset might tear a hole in causality itself. "So what happens if I choose to be Marcus Kane?" he asked. "You lose the scientific knowledge necessary to destroy the equipment. The Soviets capture it, and within 8 years, the world ends in nuclear fire. And if I choose to be Marcus Kruger, you gain the knowledge, but also the emotional detachment of someone who helped create weapons of mass destruction. You might save the world, but you'll never again be capable of the empathy that makes salvation worthwhile." "And the third option?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible above the sounds of battle. "Mutual annihilation. The safest choice for humanity. The worst choice for you." Marcus looked at the photograph one last time. The boy's eyes seemed to be pleading with him, not for survival, but for understanding. "There is a fourth option," he said slowly. "One you haven't considered." Volkov raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Marcus walked to the central chair and sat down. Immediately, the temporal field intensified, and the mirrors began showing scenes from all 47 previous iterations. "I don't choose between the timelines. I merge them consciously, on my terms. I become both Marcus Kane and Marcus Kruger, not sequentially, not in conflict, but simultaneously." "That's impossible," Volkov protested. "The human mind can't sustain two complete sets of memories and experiences." "The human mind, no," Marcus agreed, reaching for the controls on the chair's armrest. "But maybe something more than human can." Eleanor stepped forward urgently. "Marcus, the stress could kill you. Or worse, it could fragment your consciousness across multiple timelines simultaneously." Above them, the sounds of battle were getting closer. American voices in the corridor now, methodically clearing each room. "Then I better work fast," Marcus said, and activated the temporal displacement device. Pain. It started as a whisper behind Marcus's eyes and exploded into a symphony of agony that seemed to rewrite every nerve ending in his body. The temporal displacement chair hummed with malevolent energy as reality began to bend around him like heated glass. In the mirrors, Marcus saw himself multiplying, not just the two conflicting timelines of Kane and Kruger, but dozens of variations. Here was Marcus, the American war hero. There was Marcus, the German scientist. In another reflection, he saw himself as a child who had never left Germany, growing up to become his father's greatest disappointment. In yet another, he glimpsed a version of himself who had died on Omaha Beach. His consciousness never transferred at all. "Stop!" Davies shouted, but his voice seemed to come from miles away. "You're tearing yourself apart." But Marcus couldn't stop. The machinery had taken control now, feeding on the temporal paradox of his existence like a fire consuming oxygen. Energy crackled between the mirrors, and with each spark, another timeline revealed itself. Marcus, the resistance fighter, helping Allied spies escape Nazi Germany. Marcus, the SS officer, coldly efficient in his father's experiments. Marcus, the American physicist, working on the Manhattan Project. Marcus, the broken veteran, dying alone in a Pittsburgh hospital. Marcus, the Nobel Prize winner, celebrated for advances in quantum mechanics. Marcus, the war criminal, hiding in South America. Each reflection was equally real, equally possible, equally him. "The convergence is cascading," Eleanor shouted over the machine's roar. "All possible versions of Marcus are trying to exist simultaneously." Volkov backed toward the door, his face pale with terror. "This is not what Heinrich intended. The field is destabilizing." But Eleanor wasn't looking at Marcus anymore. She was staring at the mirrors, and her expression had changed from concern to something approaching awe. "Wait," she said softly. "Look at the pattern." Through the chaos of infinite reflections, Marcus began to see it too. The timelines weren't random. They were organized, structured, flowing according to some vast design. And at the center of the pattern was something that made his breath catch. A 13th mirror, one that hadn't been there before, showing not Marcus, but Eleanor herself, but Eleanor as she truly was. In the reflection, she wasn't the middle-aged French resistance member they had met. She was young, perhaps 25, wearing the white coat of a scientist. Her hair was blonde instead of grey, her face unmarked by time or worry. And standing beside her in the reflection was Dr. Heinrich Krüger, very much alive. "You're not Eleanor Dubois," Marcus gasped, somehow maintaining consciousness despite the temporal storm raging around him. The woman who had called herself Eleanor smiled sadly. "No, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Krüger, Heinrich's daughter, your sister." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The temporal field fluctuated wildly as his emotional state changed, and several of the mirrors cracked under the strain. "Sister?" Davies stared between them in shock. "But that's impossible. You're older than he is." "Time is relative," Elizabeth replied, never taking her eyes off Marcus, "especially when you've been traveling through it for 30 years. Volkov's men were backing toward the corridor now, their weapons useless against forces they couldn't comprehend. But Volkov himself remained, fascinated despite his fear. "Explain," he demanded. Elizabeth glanced at the laboratory ceiling, where the sounds of battle were growing closer, then began speaking rapidly. Heinrich Krüger didn't just create temporal displacement technology. He discovered that time itself is malleable, that consciousness can be moved not just between moments, but between entire causal streams. When the Reich began to fall, he didn't just save Marcus, he saved me too. In the mirrors, Marcus could see the story unfolding. A young woman in 1944, helping her father with his final experiments as Allied bombs fell around them. But unlike Marcus, who was sent forward to a specific time and place, I was scattered across the timeline itself. I've been moving through time for decades, always slightly out of phase with normal causality, watching and waiting and trying to guide events toward the one outcome where humanity survives. "The nuclear war," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him despite the pain. "You've seen it happen. I've lived through it. Multiple versions of it. In some timelines, it starts in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. In others, it begins in 1956, when Soviet agents use Heinrich's technology to assassinate President Eisenhower and replace him with a temporal duplicate. In the worst timeline, it starts tomorrow, when Volkov's extraction team successfully captures this equipment and transports it to Moscow. The temporal field pulsed, and Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, touching each of the possible timelines Elizabeth described. He experienced the flash of nuclear fire over Washington, felt the radiation death of millions, watched civilization collapse into radioactive ash. But he also experienced the alternatives, timelines where the technology was destroyed, where humanity survived, where the future held hope instead of annihilation. "The loop," he said. "You created it, not Heinrich." Elizabeth nodded. "Heinrich died in 1944, just after sending you forward. I've been maintaining the temporal machinery ever since, resetting time each time events moved toward catastrophe. But the system is failing. This is our last chance to get it right." Above them, an explosion shook the entire building. Dust rained from the ceiling, and several banks of electronic equipment shorted out in showers of sparks. "American forces have reached the main floor," Davies reported, listening to his radio. "They're requesting immediate evacuation of all Allied personnel." "We're out of time," Elizabeth said urgently. "Marcus, you have to choose now, not between Kane and Krüger, but between all possible versions of yourself. Which timeline do you want to make real?" In the mirrors, Marcus could see them all, every possible future branching from this moment. Some led to nuclear holocaust, others to technological paradise. Many led to futures so strange he couldn't comprehend them. But one timeline stood out from the rest. In this reflection, Marcus saw himself older, greying, standing in what appeared to be the same laboratory but transformed. No longer a place of desperate experiments, but a research facility. dedicated to peaceful uses of temporal science. Beside him stood not the bitter, war-damaged versions of himself from other timelines, but a man who had found a way to integrate the experiences of both Marcus Kane and Marcus Kruger without losing his humanity. "That one," he said, pointing to the mirror. "The timeline where I survive with both sets of memories intact, but use the knowledge to prevent temporal warfare instead of enabling it." "Impossible," Volkov protested. "The human mind cannot contain two complete lifetimes." "Maybe not a normal human mind," Marcus agreed. "But I'm not normal anymore, am I? I've been living in the space between timelines for 10 years. I've been changing, adapting, becoming something new." Elizabeth studied the mirror he had chosen, her expression unreadable. "It's the most difficult path. In that timeline, you remember everything. Every experiment Heinrich conducted, every life that was lost or saved, every moral compromise that led to this moment. Can you live with that weight?" "Can I live without it?" Marcus countered. "If I choose ignorance, others will inevitably rediscover this technology. The cycle will begin again." Another explosion, much closer. Through the laboratory door, Marcus could see flashlight beams in the corridor, American soldiers moving methodically toward their position. "The choice is made," Elizabeth said, moving to a control panel on the far wall. "But making it real requires a sacrifice. The temporal field needs an anchor point in normal causality, someone who exists fully in linear time." "What kind of sacrifice?" Marcus asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer. "I've been unstuck in time for 30 years, Elizabeth said simply. "To anchor your chosen timeline, I need to surrender my temporal mobility and exist in only one moment. It will limit my existence considerably." She was offering to die to make his future possible. "Elizabeth, no, there has to be another way." "There is," said Volkov suddenly. Everyone turned to look at the Soviet scientist, who had been listening to their exchange with growing fascination. "I could serve as the anchor," he said. "My consciousness is still fully embedded in linear time. If I were to merge with the temporal field—" "You'd die," Davies said bluntly. Volkov shrugged. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I'd become something new like Marcus. The science is fascinating enough to be worth the risk." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Why would you sacrifice yourself?" The Russian smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. "Because I've spent my entire career trying to weaponize knowledge that should be used to save lives. This is my chance to correct that mistake." The sound of American voices echoed from the corridor, very close now. "Any Allied personnel in the area, identify yourselves immediately." Elizabeth looked between Marcus and Volkov, her hand hovering over the control panel. "If we're going to do this, it has to be now. The temporal field is already destabilizing. In 30 seconds, the machinery will overload, and everything we've worked for will be lost." Marcus felt the weight of infinite possibilities pressing down on him. In his chosen timeline, he saw himself working with international teams to establish ethical guidelines for temporal research, preventing the weaponization of time itself, using the technology to heal rather than harm. But he also saw the cost, the knowledge of every life Heinrich's experiments had taken, every moral compromise that had led to this moment. The constant awareness that a single mistake could unravel causality itself. "Do it," he said. Elizabeth's hand moved toward the controls. "Wait!" Volkov called out. He walked to Marcus and extended his hand. "Comrade, I hope you use this gift wisely." Marcus shook the Russian's hand, feeling the man's genuine hope for redemption, even in the face of probable death. "I'll try," he said. Volkov moved to the central chair, displacing Marcus, who stepped back toward the mirrors. "For what it's worth," the Russian said, "I think Heinrich would be proud of the man you've become, both versions of him." Elizabeth initiated the sequence. The temporal field exploded outward with the force of a small star. Reality bent twisted, and for one impossible moment Marcus existed in all timelines simultaneously. He felt every possible version of his life, every choice he might have made, every path he could have walked. Then the field collapsed, dragging all possibilities into a single, blazing point of existence. When the light faded, Marcus stood alone in a laboratory that was both familiar and strange. The mirrors showed only one reflection now, his own, but somehow deeper, more complex, as if layers of experience were visible beneath the surface. Volkov was gone, but not dead, transformed into something that existed partially in the temporal field itself, a guardian presence that Marcus could sense but not see. And Elizabeth. "Hello, brother," she said. But when Marcus turned, he saw that she too had changed. She appeared younger, more solid, but her eyes held depths that spoke of decades spent wandering through time. "The loop is broken," she confirmed. "The timeline is stable. But Marcus, this is just the beginning. The knowledge you carry now, the responsibility, it's going to change everything." Through the laboratory door, Marcus could hear American soldiers calling for survivors. Soon, he would have to explain what had happened here, would have to decide how much truth the world was ready to hear. But for now, he simply stood in the aftermath of choice, feeling the weight of 2 lifetimes settling into his consciousness like sediment in still water. He was Marcus Kane, the American soldier who had stormed Omaha Beach. He was Marcus Kruger, the German scientist who had helped develop temporal displacement technology. He was both. He was neither. He was something entirely new, and somewhere in the depths of his merged memories, he could feel the beginning of understanding, not just of what Heinrich had created, but of what humanity might become if this power were used wisely. The photograph from the safe was still in his pocket, but when he looked at it now, it showed neither the 8-year-old boy nor the American soldier. Instead, it showed a man with ancient eyes and a determined expression, standing in a laboratory filled with equipment that could rewrite history itself. At the bottom of the photograph, in handwriting that was unmistakably his own but somehow different, were the words, "The future is not written, we write it ourselves, one choice at a time." Outside, Davies was shouting his name, guiding American forces toward the laboratory. Marcus took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the door, toward explanations, consequences, and a future that was now entirely his responsibility to shape. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a sterile interrogation room in the American military compound at Cherbourg, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Across the metal table, Colonel James Morrison, no relation to the Morrison from his fragmented memories, shuffled through a stack of photographs and documents with the methodical patience of a career intelligence officer. "Let me see if I understand this correctly, Sergeant Kane," Morrison said, his Boston accent sharp in the confined space. "You're claiming that you discovered a functional time travel device in a Nazi weapons factory, used it to merge 2 different versions of yourself, and that a Soviet scientist voluntarily sacrificed himself to prevent nuclear war." "That's a simplified version, yes, sir." Morrison set down a photograph, the one from the safe, showing the 8-year-old boy who was unmistakably Marcus. "And you expect me to believe that this photograph, allegedly taken in 1923, shows you as a child?" Marcus met the colonel's skeptical gaze steadily. Over the past 72 hours, he had learned to navigate the strange duality of his merged consciousness. When he needed Marcus Kane's memories, military protocol, American cultural references, the proper way to address superior officers, they were there, clear and accessible. When he needed Marcus Kruger's knowledge, scientific principles, German technical terminology, the theoretical framework of temporal mechanics, that was available too. The challenge wasn't accessing the memories. The challenge was living with all of them simultaneously. "Sir, I know how it sounds. 3 days ago I would have reacted the same way. But the evidence is there. The laboratory, the equipment, Lieutenant Davies's testimony, Lieutenant Davies is in the psychiatric wing, Morrison interrupted. He keeps insisting that he saw you talking to a woman who claimed to be your sister from the future, and that reality was, how did he put it? Folding like origami. Marcus felt a pang of guilt. Davies had witnessed something beyond human comprehension and was paying the price for it. But there had been no other way. The temporal convergence couldn't have been hidden or explained away. The woman called herself Eleanor Dubois when we first met her, Marcus said carefully. Her real name is Dr. Elizabeth Kruger. She's your sister, so you've said. Morrison leaned back in his chair. Tell me, Sergeant, if you really do have access to advanced German scientific knowledge, can you prove it? Marcus had been expecting this question for 3 days. The answer would determine whether he was treated as a valuable intelligence asset or committed to the same psychiatric facility as Davies. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notebook. Not Heinrich's journal, which remained hidden, but a fresh one he had filled with equations and diagrams over the past few nights. Temporal displacement requires solving several theoretical problems that mainstream physics won't approach for decades, he said, sliding the notebook across the table. Energy conservation across timeline boundaries, consciousness mapping at the quantum level, causality loop prevention algorithms. The mathematics are complex, but they're all there. Morrison opened the notebook and frowned at the dense equations covering the first page. This could be gibberish, for all I know. Page 12 contains the mathematical proof for faster-than-light communication using quantum-entangled particles separated across time rather than space. Page 18 shows how to generate sustainable fusion reactions using temporal acceleration fields. Page 24 describes the theoretical framework for consciousness transfer between biological and mechanical substrates. The Colonel's frown deepened. You're describing science fiction. I'm describing the science that Heinrich Kruger developed between 1941 and 1944. Some of it is purely theoretical. Some of it worked well enough to tear my consciousness out of one timeline and implant it in another. Morrison closed the notebook and studied Marcus with new intensity. Assuming any of this is real, and I'm not saying it is, what exactly are you proposing we do about it? This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for, the conversation that would determine whether humanity's future held wisdom or warfare. The equipment in the factory represents the most dangerous technology ever created, he said. In the wrong hands, it could be used to assassinate historical figures, alter the outcomes of wars, or collapse causality itself. It needs to be destroyed completely. And you're willing to help us do that? I'm insisting on it. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, drumming his fingers on the table. Finally, he said, "There's something else. Something we haven't told you yet." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Sir? The factory in Normandy wasn't the only one. Over the past week, we've received reports from our intelligence networks across Europe. Similar facilities have been discovered in Bavaria, Austria, and the Sudetenland. All abandoned, all containing similar equipment. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. Heinrich's work had been distributed across multiple sites, making the threat exponentially larger than he had imagined. How many sites? He asked. 7 that we know of. The British found 2, we found 3, and the French discovered 2 more. But here's the interesting part. According to our preliminary investigations, they're all still active. The equipment is running, drawing power from sources we can't identify, maintaining some kind of field around each location. Marcus closed his eyes and reached into Marcus Kruger's memories, searching for any mention of a distributed network. The answer came like a punch to the stomach. "Das Netzwerk," he whispered. "What?" "The network." Heinrich didn't just create temporal displacement technology. He created a network of interconnected temporal fields spanning across Germany and occupied territories. Each facility was designed to reinforce the others, creating a web of temporal stability that could survive even if individual nodes were destroyed. Morrison leaned forward. "What's the purpose of this network?" Marcus drew on both sets of memories, combining Marcus Kane's strategic thinking with Marcus Kruger's scientific knowledge. The answer terrified him. Insurance, he said. If the Reich fell, the network would remain active, waiting for someone with the proper knowledge to reactivate it. Heinrich wasn't just trying to save me and Elizabeth. He was preserving the possibility of rewriting history itself. Rewriting it how? By sending agents back to prevent Germany's defeat, by altering key battles, assassinating Allied leaders, ensuring Nazi victory through temporal intervention. Marcus felt sick as the implications became clear. The network has been dormant for 10 years, but if someone were to access it with the right codes, could they actually change the past? Not change it, replace it, overwrite our timeline with one where the Axis powers won the war. Morrison stared at him in silence for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. How do we stop it? The network has a central control node. According to Heinrich's notes, it was hidden in the most secure location he could imagine, somewhere even the Allies would never think to look. Where? Marcus met the colonel's eyes. Inside the Reich Chancellery, in Hitler's personal bunker, beneath Berlin. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of military vehicles moving through the compound outside. The Soviets control Berlin, Morrison said finally. Yes, sir. They've been occupying the bunker complex for nearly 10 years. Yes, sir. If this network exists, if it's really capable of what you're describing, they may have already found it. Marcus nodded grimly. That would explain the unusual Soviet activity in the region. They're not just here to capture temporal technology, they're here to test it. The factory in Normandy was probably meant to be their first experiment in timeline alteration. Morrison stood up abruptly and began pacing the small room. This is beyond classified, beyond top secret. If word of this leaks, it could trigger a war with the Soviets before we're prepared to fight it. Sir, if the network is activated, there won't be a war. There won't be an America to fight one. The Soviets could send agents back to 1941, provide Stalin with advanced weapons technology, ensure German defeat through overwhelming force rather than attrition. They could reshape the entire 20th century. The colonel stopped pacing and fixed Marcus with a stare that could have melted steel. What do you recommend? A joint operation. Myself. A small team of specialists. Infiltration into Soviet-occupied Berlin. We locate the central node and destroy it before the network can be activated. That's suicide. Even if we could get you into Berlin, the bunker complex is one of the most heavily guarded locations in Soviet territory. I have advantages other operatives don't, Marcus said quietly. I know the bunker's layout from Heinrich's memories. I understand the technology well enough to identify and disable it quickly. And I have something else, temporal awareness, that makes me partially unstuck from linear causality. What does that mean? Marcus had discovered this ability during his interrogation sessions. While his consciousness existed primarily in the present moment, he retained a strange sensitivity to temporal fluctuations, an ability to sense when timeline alterations were occurring. I can detect temporal anomalies, he explained. If someone is using the network to alter the past, I'll know about it before the changes fully propagate. It gives us a small window to respond. Morrison resumed his pacing. Even if I believed all of this, and I'm not saying I do, the political implications are staggering. We'd need authorization from the highest levels, coordination with multiple intelligence agencies, resources that don't officially exist. Colonel? Marcus said, standing up. 3 days ago, I was a simple soldier on a routine inspection mission. Today, I carry the memories and knowledge of a Nazi scientist who created technology that could unravel human history. I didn't choose this responsibility, but it's mine now. He walked to the room's single window and looked out at the military compound, at soldiers going about their daily routines, oblivious to the temporal sword hanging over their heads. Every minute we wait increases the chance that someone activates the network. Every hour of delay gives the Soviets more time to study Heinrich's work and develop their own timeline alteration capabilities. This isn't about politics or authorization or official channels. This is about survival. Morrison joined him at the window. You're talking about preventing a war that might not happen by starting one that definitely will. I'm talking about preventing the end of everything we've fought to preserve. They stood in silence, watching soldiers drill in the compound's central yard. Young men who had no idea that their existence might depend on decisions being made in a sterile interrogation room. Finally, Morrison spoke. There's someone you need to meet. Someone who's been waiting to talk to you since we pulled you out of that factory. Who? Her name is Dr. Sarah Chen. She's with a joint Allied scientific committee that's been investigating reports of unusual German technology since 1945. According to her preliminary analysis of the equipment we recovered, you're not the only person dealing with temporal complications. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of complications? Other soldiers, other civilians, showing up in various locations across Europe with impossible memories, anachronistic knowledge, and stories that don't match historical records. Dr. Chen believes we may be dealing with a network of displaced individuals, people whose consciousnesses were scattered across time by Heinrich's experiments. The implications were staggering. Marcus had assumed he was unique, the sole survivor of Heinrich's temporal manipulation. But if there were others, how many? He asked. Dr. Chen's committee has documented 47 cases in the past year alone, all with similar symptoms: fragmented memories, knowledge of events they shouldn't know about, physical evidence that contradicts their reported personal histories. Marcus gripped the window frame. 47, the same number of iterations Elizabeth mentioned, the same number of times the loop reset. What loop? But Marcus was already moving toward the door. If there were 47 other people dealing with temporal displacement, then Heinrich's network was far more complex than he had imagined. And if Dr. Chen was right about the continuing anomalies. "Colonel," he said urgently, "we need to see Dr. Chen immediately. And then we need to contact every Allied intelligence service in Europe, because I don't think the network is dormant anymore. I think it's been active this entire time, and we're only now beginning to see the effects." Morrison grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. What kind of effects? Marcus thought about Elizabeth's warnings, about the multiple timelines she had witnessed ending in nuclear fire, about the delicate balance required to prevent temporal warfare, the kind that end with all of us never having existed at all. As they left the interrogation room, Marcus caught his reflection in the polished metal of the doorframe. For just a moment, his reflection showed not one face but dozens, all the possible versions of himself that had been collapsed into this single timeline, all the futures that depended on the choices he was about to make. The weight of temporal responsibility had never felt heavier. Berlin, Soviet sector, November 15th, 1954. Marcus crouched in the ruins of what had once been the Reich Chancellery, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter cold. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Chen adjusted her temporal detection equipment, a device cobbled together from Heinrich's notes and components salvaged from the Normandy facility. "The readings are off the charts," she whispered, her Chinese-American accent barely audible above the wind that howled through the bombed-out buildings. "Whatever's down there, it's been active for hours." Behind them, hidden in the shadow of a collapsed wall, Elizabeth waited with the small team Morrison had assembled: 2 British commandos, a French resistance veteran, and Davies, who had insisted on joining the mission despite his recent psychological trauma. "Any sign of the Soviet guards?" Marcus asked. "Shift change happened 10 minutes ago," reported Sergeant Mills, one of the British commandos. "We have maybe 20 minutes before the next patrol." Marcus closed his eyes and reached out with his temporal awareness, the strange sixth sense he had developed since merging his 2 timelines. What he felt made his blood run cold. The past was changing, not gradually, not subtly, but in massive, violent alterations that rippled forward through history like tsunami waves. Somewhere below them, someone was using Heinrich's network to rewrite reality itself. "We're too late," he said. "They've already started." "Started what?" Chen asked. Marcus opened his eyes and saw his worst fears confirmed in her temporal readouts. Timeline replacement. They're not just altering individual events, they're overwriting entire decades of history. Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could feel the changes cascading toward their present moment. June 6, 1944. D-Day fails catastrophically as German forces, forewarned by temporal intelligence, slaughter Allied troops on the beaches. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor becomes a complete surprise success as Japanese planes, guided by future knowledge, destroy the entire Pacific Fleet. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa succeeds as German forces equipped with advanced weapons technology steamroll through an unprepared Soviet Union. May 8, 1945. Instead of German surrender, it's Roosevelt and Churchill signing unconditional surrender documents in a bunker beneath Washington, D.C. "The whole war," Marcus gasped. "They're changing the entire war." Elizabeth moved to his side, her face pale with understanding. "The network isn't just rewriting history. It's creating a new timeline where the Axis powers won. In maybe 10 minutes, this reality will cease to exist." "Then we go in now," Mills said, checking his weapon. "Hard and fast." "No," Marcus said, standing up. "You all stay here. This is something I have to do alone." "Like hell," Davies objected. "I've come this far." "Davies, listen to me." Marcus gripped his friend's shoulder. "What's down there? It's not just Soviet scientists or stolen German technology. It's Heinrich himself." The team stared at him in shock. "Impossible," Chen breathed. "He died in 1944. "His body died," Marcus corrected. "But before he died, he uploaded his consciousness into the network's central node. He's been waiting there for 10 years, dormant, until someone with the proper access codes could awaken him." Elizabeth nodded grimly. "The Soviets found the bunker, but they couldn't activate the system without the correct genetic and psychological markers. They've been feeding captured temporal refugees into the network, trying to find someone compatible enough to serve as Heinrich's new host body. And now they have one," Marcus realized. "One of the other displaced individuals, someone Heinrich can possess completely." "Then how do we stop him?" Mills demanded. Marcus looked at each member of the team, these brave souls who had followed him into what might be their final mission. "You don't. I go down alone, confront Heinrich directly, and hope that the part of me that's still Marcus Kane is strong enough to resist whatever he has planned." "And if it's not?" Davies asked quietly. Marcus smiled sadly. "Then I make sure the network burns, even if I burn with it." A name. The entrance to Hitler's bunker had been sealed by the Soviets with a heavy steel door, but Marcus's enhanced memories included the location of Heinrich's private access tunnel, a route known only to the Temporal Project's inner circle. He crawled through the narrow passage for what felt like hours, guided by Marcus Kruger's childhood memories of exploring these very tunnels while his father worked in the laboratory below. The air grew colder and more stale with each meter, carrying strange odors that seemed to exist partially outside normal time. Finally, he emerged into the bunker's main corridor. The familiar Nazi architecture felt like a fever dream. The same sterile efficiency Marcus Kane had seen when Allied forces first captured similar facilities, but overlaid with Marcus Kruger's memories of this place as home. Soviet guards had been posted at regular intervals, but they weren't looking for intruders. They were looking outward, as if protecting something inside from external threats rather than preventing entry. Marcus moved past them with the careful silence his military training had ingrained. But he noticed something disturbing. Several of the guards appeared to be frozen in place, their eyes vacant, their breathing so slow it was almost imperceptible. Temporal stasis. Heinrich was using the guards as living batteries, draining their life force to power the network. At the end of the corridor stood the door to Heinrich's laboratory, marked with the same symbols Marcus had seen in Normandy. But this door was different. It seemed to shift and blur when he wasn't looking directly at it, as if it existed partially in multiple timelines simultaneously. Marcus took a deep breath and opened the door. The laboratory beyond defied physical laws. The room was simultaneously the sterile Nazi research facility from Heinrich's memories and something far stranger. A space that existed at the intersection of all possible timelines, where the walls showed glimpses of every reality the network had access to. In the center of the room, connected to a massive array of temporal manipulation equipment, sat a figure that made Marcus's heart stop. It was himself. Not Marcus Kane or Marcus Kruger, but a third version, one he had never seen in any of the mirrors or memories. This Marcus wore a mixture of German and Soviet military insignia, his face bearing scars that spoke of battles in timelines that had never existed. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall at his command. "Welcome home, my son," the figure said, though the voice was unmistakably Heinrich's. "You're just in time to witness the birth of the Fourth Reich." Around the possessed Marcus, holographic displays showed the progress of the timeline alterations. Axis victory was spreading like a virus through history, overwriting everything Marcus Kane had fought to preserve. "You're not Heinrich," Marcus said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You're just an echo, a copy of his memories preserved in the network." The figure smiled with Marcus's face. "I am Heinrich Kruger, preserved and perfected through 10 years of temporal evolution. And you, my true son, are about to help me complete the greatest experiment in human history. By destroying everything decent and brave that humanity achieved. By creating a timeline where Germany's technological superiority leads to a truly unified world. No more wars, no more conflict. Just the eternal peace of absolute order." Marcus looked at the displays showing Nazi banners flying over London, Moscow, Washington. "That's not peace. That's death. It's evolution." The Heinrich thing stood up, and Marcus could see the cables and conduits that connected it to the temporal network. The weak have had their chance to lead. Now it's time for the strong to shape reality itself. Through his temporal awareness, Marcus felt the changes accelerating. In maybe 5 minutes, the alterations would reach their present moment. Reality as he knew it would cease to exist. "There's something you don't understand," Marcus said, walking closer to the central console. "Something the original Heinrich never realized." "What?" "The network doesn't just change the past. It creates temporal debt, a build-up of causality pressure that has to be discharged somewhere. You're not just rewriting history, you're destabilizing the entire timeline matrix." The Heinrich thing paused, and for a moment genuine uncertainty flickered across its stolen features. "Every change you make creates paradox pressure," Marcus continued, reaching into his pocket for the original photograph, the image of the 8-year-old boy that had started everything. "And when that pressure reaches critical mass," he held up the photograph. In it, the boy's face was flickering, becoming unstable, as if the image itself was being torn apart by temporal forces. "Universal causality collapse," Marcus finished. "Not just the destruction of our timeline, but the destruction of the concept of time itself. You're not creating a new reality. You're ending the possibility of any reality." The Heinrich thing stared at the photograph, and Marcus could see genuine fear entering its eyes for the first time. "That's impossible. The mathematics are wrong." Heinrich was brilliant, but he was working with incomplete data. "I have access to something he never did, the perspective of someone who has existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. I can see the damage you're causing." Around them, the laboratory began to shake. Cracks appeared in the walls, bleeding light that hurt to look at directly. "The network is overloading," Marcus said urgently. "You have maybe 2 minutes to shut it down before the cascade becomes irreversible." No, the Heinrich thing snarled. I've waited 10 years for this moment. I won't let you destroy everything I've built. It lunged toward Marcus, moving with inhuman speed and strength borrowed from the temporal field. But Marcus had been expecting this. He rolled aside and came up near the central control console. I'm not going to destroy it, he said, his hands flying over the controls with memories drawn from both timelines. I'm going to redirect it. Instead of shutting down the network, Marcus began rerouting its power. Not to change the past, but to stabilize the present, to create a temporal anchor point that would prevent any future alterations. What are you doing? The Heinrich thing demanded. Making sure this never happens again. Marcus input the final command sequence, using authorization codes that existed in both Marcus Kane's and Marcus Kruger's memories. The network's power, instead of flowing outward to rewrite history, began flowing inward, creating a temporal lock that would preserve the current timeline against any future manipulation. But the process required a conscious mind to serve as the lock's key, someone who would remain connected to the network, ensuring that no one could ever again use temporal technology to alter reality. You'll have to stay connected, the Heinrich thing realized with growing horror. You'll be trapped in the network forever, conscious but unable to act, unable to live. Marcus smiled as he felt the temporal lock engaging, felt his consciousness beginning to merge with the network's quantum substrate. That's the idea. Someone has to guard the timeline. Someone has to make sure that what happened here today never happens again. The Heinrich thing made one last desperate lunge, but it was too late. The network's power was already being redirected, and the possessed Marcus began to fade like smoke as the stolen consciousness was dispersed back into pure data. You don't understand, it whispered as it dissolved. Without me, without the network's power, humanity will destroy itself. The nuclear war Elizabeth saw, the timeline where civilization ends, that's still coming. You've only delayed it, not prevented it. Maybe, Marcus admitted as he felt his physical form beginning to merge with the temporal matrix. But at least when it comes, it will be humanity's choice. Our mistakes, our responsibility, our chance to find another way. The laboratory filled with blinding light as the temporal lock engaged fully. Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, becoming one with the network while simultaneously isolating it from external manipulation. He could sense every temporal facility across Europe shutting down, every piece of Heinrich's technology becoming inert metal and circuits. In his final moments of individual thought, Marcus reached out through the network and found the 47 other displaced individuals scattered across Europe. With the last of the network's power, he restored their original memories, gave them back their true identities, and severed their connections to temporal displacement. They would live normal lives now, with only the faintest memory of the impossible things they had experienced. As his consciousness dissolved into the temporal matrix, Marcus thought he heard Elizabeth's voice, carried on waves of causality itself. Thank you, brother. For all of us, across all timelines, thank you. Epilogue, December 1954. Davies stood in the cemetery outside Bayeux, laying flowers on a grave marked simply, Marcus Kane, American soldier, died in service to his country. It was a lie, of course. Marcus hadn't died exactly, but he had sacrificed everything human about himself to become something else, a guardian consciousness existing at the intersection of all possible timelines, ensuring that temporal warfare could never again threaten reality. The official report says he died in an equipment malfunction during the bunker investigation, Colonel Morrison said, joining Davies at the graveside. Heroic sacrifice in service of Allied security interests. And the truth? Davies asked. The truth is classified at levels that don't officially exist. But I'll tell you this. The temporal anomalies Dr. Chen was tracking have all ceased. The 47 displaced individuals have returned to normal lives with their memories restored. and according to our monitoring equipment, time itself has become remarkably stable. Davies placed his hand on the headstone. Do you think he's still aware? Still Marcus? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Doctor, Chen believes consciousness is more resilient than we imagine. She thinks some part of him continues to exist within the temporal matrix, not as Marcus Kane or Marcus Kruger, but as something new, a guardian. Guardian of what? Of choice, Morrison replied. Of the right of every human being to write their own future, make their own mistakes, find their own redemption. As they walked away from the grave, neither man noticed the brief flicker in the headstone's inscription. For just a moment, instead of Marcus Kane, it read Marcus Kruger, then Marcus, then simply Guardian. In the quantum depths of space-time itself, a consciousness that had once been human watched over the timeline, ensuring that the future remained unwritten, full of infinite possibility and hope. The echo of time had finally found peace.